Welcome everybody to the Let's Talk series. I'm Jude and I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I speak from Aboriginal land, the land of the Camaragal people of the Eora Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and to any Aboriginal people who may be with us. So tonight's topic is, I've called it code breaking and the way of trust. And that sounds like probably quite a mysteriously interesting title. But what I wanted to focus on tonight is probably an extension of things I've been talking about over the past few weeks. And again, I bring some of the lovely teachings of Buddha in tonight. And so tonight is about breaking the code of the ego, because the ego speaks to us when we are doing work on ourselves, spiritual or personal work on ourselves. It's all about ego. And ego operates often in a very coded manner. And breaking that code is actually really important, I've found, from my own journey and my own experience. And, you know, Buddha talked about desire and attachment being the root of all human suffering. And the fact is that desire is very, very coded. And we experience desire when, well, the ego will prompt us to experience desire when it doesn't want us to experience something else. That is painful, because the ego hates pain. And the irony of the ego is that it is drawn to negativity. So, you know, if a day comes and goes, and perhaps during this day you had a really good day, but, you know, and you had a lot of lovely interactions with people, and one person may have criticised you or said something to you that fell into the negative bracket. And at the end of the day, what you've been ruminating on all day is not all the positive stuff that happened, but it's that one tiny little negative thing. And ego just is magnetically attracted to negativity, absolutely loves it. And so generally when the ego is feeding us a desire for something or an attachment to something, well, desire springs out of attachment. And usually that desire bears no relationship to what is really going on. And in fact, it is there as a mask, and desire can very effectively mask what really is going on for me. And The great mystic poet Kabir, I don't know if you know Kabir, but he really is a wonderful poet, and he writes about this journey in beautiful and existential ways. So I'm going to write you, I'm not going to write you, I'm going to read you a poem of Kabir's, which speaks precisely to what I'm saying. So it begins, friend, please tell me what I can do about this world I hold to and keep spinning out. I gave up sewn clothes and wore a robe, but I noticed one day that the cloth was well woven. So I bought some burlap, but I still threw it elegantly over my left shoulder. I pulled back my sexual longings, and now I discover that I'm angry a lot. I gave up rage, and now I notice that I'm greedy all day. I worked hard at the greed, and now I am proud of myself. When the mind wants to break its link with the world, it still holds on to one thing. Great poem. And so, how can we understand what perpetuates the difficulties that we encounter when we get onto a path of spiritual growth or personal development, which to me they're synonymous? So the fact is that when we do consciously commit to a path of self-improvement, we are going to have every obstacle thrown in our way imaginable. And this is the reality. And the reason is that we have chosen to grow. And when we make that choice to grow, however subtle it may be, the fact is we're not going to grow if we're not challenged. And look, I see this happening just across the board. When people, I've done a huge amount of work with people who have addictions, various and sundry addictions. So when they go into a recovery program, they'll have quite a nice sort of honeymoon period. And then the first challenge comes along, and then the next and the next. It's the way it is. So when we make that decision and that commitment to improve ourselves in some way, we will be tested. And so we name the demons as they come and go. And when we do this, our heart can hold them more lightly. So without judgment, we become what Ram Dass calls a connoisseur of our neuroses. And then we are ready for a deeper opening up internally, for understanding what is at the root of our demons or our desires. Each of our demons, now in Raj Yoga, we would call them the 5 vices of anger, lust, ego, greed, and attachment. For Buddha, it was a different set, but he had 5, sleepiness being one of them. But each of them is a spiritual and emotional contraction. All of them come from the ego and are generated by fear. So it is fear that creates a contracted and phony sense of self. This small self, or what Eckhart Tolle refers to as the big I, the ego being the big I, because the ego wants, it's all about me, and my. So it is protective of itself. So it grasps our emotions, our thoughts, our body, our limited body, our limited emotions, our limited thoughts, and holds on to them. And from this limited sense of self arises a sense of deficiency and need, defensive anger, and the barriers we build for protection. Afraid to open, to change, and to live fully, we're unable to feel the whole of life. And the contracted identification with the body of fear, or as Eckhart Tolle would call it, the pain body, becomes a habit and eventually an addiction. And our identity becomes part of our identity. So out of that, greed, hatred, and delusion can arise. I don't know if any of you have read Eckhart Tolle. He certainly is worth reading. I think his first book is a heavy read. His second book, A New Earth, is a much better read, much easier read. But he talks about the pain body, and which is rooted in ego, and how this becomes such a huge issue in our identity, huge part of our identity. And so the closest place to observe this process of contraction that takes place in our life is meditation. And this is why meditation is just so popular now in the psychology movement. The modern psychology movement has adopted the Buddhist practice of mindfulness, so they'd invented it. And meditation is a practice that leads us into openness and wholeness and a sense of self that comes from experiencing our true self, our original nature. And so a repeated experience of body, mind, or heart occurring in our consciousness is a signal that deeper attention is needed. And this is why, for anyone who's working on themselves, whether they're just, in therapy, bringing meditation into the equation is such a good idea, because it opens up our awareness, it opens our consciousness, and we develop insight. So we start to be able to really see what's going on from the inside, whereas therapy is more working on the outside. So these repeated experiences or patterns that occur in our consciousness are a signal that we need to go deeper. For instance, holding a pattern of sexual fantasies is one way of distracting the heart from feeling a deep loneliness or an inability to experience a deep connection with the self. You know, rule of thumb, if I'm feeling disconnected from another person, then I need to look at where I've disconnected from myself. Or if I'm feeling disconnected from others, plural, I need to look at how I've disconnected from myself. Because it's that disconnection from self that brings me into the void of existential loneliness. Different people will adapt to different patterns and processes. And so each of us has to decode our own. When we encounter an insistent visitor that keeps repeating the patterns, we must recognise the need to understand it more clearly. And this involves experimenting. And meditation is great for these experiments. Counselling is also. Particularly, I might say, Gestalt therapy, such a wonderful therapy that embraces the spiritual as well, which most therapies don't. So in order to understand what is happening underneath, I need to be able to go there. Repeating thought patterns and behaviours are our stuck places. A lot of energy gets blocked in these. And so they need to be released from the body of fear. Because when energy gets blocked up, well, first thing that's going to happen is we're going to feel it somewhere in our body. We're going to get a pain somewhere, a headache or a pain in the neck, pain in the shoulder or the foot or the knee or the something. So naming the emotion or sensation to ourselves, whatever it is we're feeling, again and again, brings it right into awareness. And sometimes this is enough to dissolve it and move into whatever is underlying that thought, that sensation or whatever. So this is because we get stuck on a different level from the obvious one we have been naming and noticing. When we shift from the obvious to a deeper level of awareness, an energy release does take place. And doubting our ability to work through these things also emanates from the fear body. The critic, for instance, the critic loves to get in on the act. Oh, this is so hard and it's too complicated. I just don't think I can be bothered. And, you know, I don't have the time to meditate anyway. And therapy is expensive. And you know, all of these excuses come along. The critic, you know, doesn't matter what I do, it's never right. So practicing stillness and silence helps to break the codes that trap us. So for the person with deeply buried or repressed issues, for instance, there might be a little bit of trauma or even a lot of trauma, hopefully not, from childhood. And the person may have adapted over time with a cover-up, some kind of cover-up manifestation in their personality or in their behaviour. So they may have adapted with by developing a very charismatic or socially skilled exterior. Maybe they're a really high achiever. Maybe they're the absolute opposite. And maybe they get into drugs or work or sex or multiple relationships or anything can be a cover-up. So at some point in life, these adaptive skills, which we may have learned from an early age, will cease to work. In terms of keeping the emotions repressed that we've been working so hard at, and so the cracks will begin to appear. And I just want to tell you a little story about somebody. I call him Tom. He was a very, very high achieving person, Tom. And he was in his, by the time he'd hit his very early 30s, he was at the top of his field internationally. And he worked for large multinational organisations in competition with one another. And by the time he got to about 40, he'd sort of reached the top. And so he decided that he would just start his own consultancy in his area of expertise. This is a true story, incidentally. So Tom is not the person's real name. And so what happened was that he resigned from his job, which was like the top job internationally in the industry, to start his own business. And the company that he worked for called him in for a meeting and said to him, "We'd like to make you an offer. We'd prefer that you don't start your own consultancy business. And what we're offering you is a payment of all these millions, not to work at all. Resign, sure, but don't work for yourself and don't work for anybody else in this field, please. And this is what we'll pay you, and we will pay you for life." So he said, "Okay, thank you very much." And he took the money. And after he did that, here he was in his early 40s, you know, very obviously a very clever person, a very high achiever. So there, afterwards, he had no work. I mean, he had nothing to do. And so what happened to him was that he began to get these horrific headaches and other symptoms that just suddenly popped up out of nowhere. And so, you know, he went to doctors and so on, and nothing basically was learned. And there was nothing that could be done to help him. But as time wore on, you know, he was suffering terribly with all these physical symptoms, which were very debilitating. And he lives not in Australia, but in another country, and I happened to be there, and we were having a bit of a chat, and he told me this stuff, and I invited him to do a workshop that I was running. And I had to get special permission for him to come because he wasn't part of the group, etc., etc. And so the group that I was running was on the process of working on ourselves, and it was all about emotional release. And so what I was explaining, and I'll explain to you now, is that the very outer layer, when we come to work on ourselves, the very outer layer is the personality, the outer personality that we've adopted. And it will be that part of us that is socially acceptable. You know, we're programmed, you know, from our childhood to be socially acceptable and to fit in. And so on the outside, there will be a whole lot of behaviours and adaptive personality mechanisms that make us liked and socially acceptable and able to fit in, and so on and so on. And so he really identified with all of that. The overachieving. What I was also pointing out was that a lot of these behaviours are part of the cover-up. You know, I was saying last week that most people, their greatest fear is the fear of being exposed. And it's the fear of being seen. This all comes from the ego, the fear of being seen without your masks and your cover-ups. It's like we can go through life just waiting, you know, for someone to come along and just pull our masks off like a big sticking plaster, and so that we feel really exposed. You know, it's like people who have dreams of finding themselves in some public place without any clothes on. You know, there's this deep-seated fear of being exposed and being vulnerable. And so at the outer emotional layer, there can be this layer of numbness. I'm not saying that is the case, but for some people that is the case, that they have very successfully with their overachieving or their drugs or their whatever it is they're doing behaviourally, very effectively numbed themselves right out. And, you know, that numbness, as unpleasant as numbness is, I mean, I've actually once in my life felt numb. One time that I particularly remember, and I found it quite terrifying. Quite terrifying. I just wanted to feel. I would rather feel pain than feel numb. Anyway, underneath numbness will be a layer of anxiety and or depression. And then people can get stuck. People may get stuck in the numbness because subliminally they know that what is underneath it, they don't want to feel. So they invest energy in the numbness, and this can happen quite unconsciously, that they don't want to move. They're so invested in staying in the numbness because they don't want to feel the anxiety or the depression that, you know, huge amounts of energy get invested in staying numb. And it becomes automatic. Energetically, it just becomes automatic. And so underneath that, if they can embrace the numbness and allow themselves to move through that, they will hit anxiety and or depression. A layer of that. And now people can, you know, a lot of people, anxiety and depression are the most commonly diagnosed mental health issues in the world now. And, you know, it's not hard to understand why, because what we repress, we don't express. And as a result, we get depressed. And if I'm depressed, I get anxious, because remember, all this is coming from the fear-based ego. And the numbness is an extreme condition that people present with, which is completely fear-based. But we have to work our way in layer by layer. And so underneath the numbness, we have this layer of anxiety and depression. Please, by the way, anyone wants to stop me, feel free to do so. And people will get stuck in the anxiety or the depression, and, you know, even be taking a whole lot of medication to numb themselves out, you know, to play around with their brain chemistry. So that they can be numb, so they want to be numb. And, you know, some new research had just been released I think it was done in America, very, very recent. This is like within the last month. Because the drug companies that make these SSRIs, which is the medication for depression, they make billions upon billions out of it, big pharma. And they spin this story. The marketing device is that, well, you're depressed because of this chemical lacking in your brain. Now, many psychiatrists have not bought that. Many psychiatrists have not bought that. And so finally, this massive amount of research being done in America, and where they researched like hundreds of thousands of people. And they have proven conclusively that people with depression, regardless of whether it's short-term or long-term or whatever type of depression it is, clinical or endogenous or blah, blah, the brain chemistry of a person who is depressed and who is not depressed is exactly the same. So that marketing cannot be used anymore. They won't like that. Anyway, people will invest a great deal in remaining anxious or depressed because subconsciously they don't want to go into what is underneath it. And what is underneath it is anger. And anger is not well regarded socially. You know, it gets very bad press. Oh, you know, she's such an angry person. I don't have anything to do with her. Or, you know, people who show their anger often aren't liked. They can get quite stigmatized. And so people, because it's not egocentric, or the ego doesn't find anger an attractive trait, and maybe doesn't, you know, the person doesn't know how to manage their anger, they will invest hugely in staying anxious or depressed to stay out of the anger. So then when we go through that into the next layer, which is anger, someone can then get stuck in the anger because actually anger can make us feel connected. It is a way of connecting with ourselves emotionally. And it is also can be an albeit very dysfunctional and ineffective way of, inaccurate way of connecting with other people. And so there can be a huge investment in staying angry and staying in the anger, because subliminally we don't want to go into the layer underneath the anger, and the layer underneath that is pain and sadness and possibly isolation. And then people develop a condition called pathological grief or a pathological sadness, or they really get into their pain and suffering, and there'll be a huge amount of blocked energy, invested in that, because again, they subliminally don't want to go into what is underneath the pain and the sadness. And what is underneath the pain and the sadness is grief. And, grief is a very interesting beast, because it is very close to the soul. And it is, in my personal belief, that when we disconnect spiritually from ourselves, we hold a layer of grief around that is wrapped around the soul. And so then the person moves into their grief, and they can invest a huge amount of energy in the grief. It is pathological grief, we call it. Because what can be under the grief is guilt and shame. Or a measure of guilt and shame. And so better to be grieving than going into that really deep layer. And so when we move from the grief into what is under that and expose it for what it is, and work on the guilt and the shame, we can then move into healing, acceptance, and forgiveness. And this takes us into the next layer, which is our true self. And so, you know, when I say breaking the code, this is what I mean, that we really have to understand how ego works and how to decode our experience of ego, because it does love to masquerade as something else, something other than what it really is, what is really going on. And, you know, the ego is the great pretender. And this is why, you know, some people, if they've got the training and the skills, can do this work. If they've got the psychological training and professional skills, they can take themselves through this. But for most people, working with a professional is strongly recommended, particularly if trauma is involved, because this work requires a witness and a person who is trained and has the professional skills to guide the process and hold the emotional space, who won't damage us in the process. So friends and family can mean well, and sometimes they can be good people to talk to, but with this kind of thing, no. Well-meaning people in our lives who we might even be very close to can really damage our healing process rather than support it, simply because they're not trained and they're not objective about us. They actually want to rescue us, or blame us or something. And so, just to give you an example of what I'm talking about, I'm just going to read you a passage or two from a wonderful book that I do recommend. I'm not sure whether it's still in print. That's the only thing. Anyway, it's by Jack Cornfield, who began as a Buddhist monk. He's a psychologist, and he's written some lovely books. And his first book is A Path with Heart. And so I just want to read this to you. The Dalai Lama has pointed out that communism worldwide did not work because it was not based on compassion and love. It was based on class struggle and dictatorial control, which in the end just doesn't work. Struggle and dictating doesn't work in our inner life either. So we must inquire what aspect of this repeated pattern is asking for acceptance and compassion, and ask ourselves, Can I touch with love whatever I have closed my heart to? This doesn't mean solving it or figuring it out. It is simply asking, what is it in me that wants acceptance? In difficult patterns of thoughts, emotions, or sensations, we must open to feel their full energy in our body, our heart, and our mind, however strongly they show themselves. And this includes opening to our reactions to this experience as well. Noticing the fear that comes up, the aversion or contraction that arises, and then accept all of it. Only then can it be released. In my earliest practice, I'm reading again, Jack Cornfield. In my earliest practice as a celibate monk, I had long bouts of lust and images of sexual fantasy. My teacher said to name them, which I did, but they often repeated. Accept this, I thought, but they'll never stop. But still, I tried it. Over days and weeks, these thoughts became even stronger. Eventually, I decided to expand my awareness to see what other feelings were present. To my surprise, I found a deep well of loneliness almost every time the fantasies arose. It wasn't all lust, it was loneliness. And the sexual images were ways of seeking comfort and closeness. But they kept arising. And then I noticed how hard it was to let myself feel the loneliness. I hated it. I resisted it. Only when I accepted this very resistance and gently held it all in compassion did it begin to subside. By expanding my attention, I learned that much of my sexuality had little to do with lust. And as I brought an acceptance to the feeling of loneliness, the compulsive quality of the fantasies gradually diminished. Okay. And so this is the last, I think this is really interesting stuff. This is the last passage I'll read you. So how is this done in practice? The loneliness I encountered that was giving rise to sexual fantasies can be an example. It returned often and painfully, even though I named and felt it with care. Loneliness has been one of my deepest sources of pain for as long as I can remember. Excuse me a sec. I'm a twin, and sometimes I think I got my brother to come along in the womb so I could have some company. As with each of the practices I've described, it's best to start with awareness of the body. As the loneliness continued to arise, I brought more careful attention to where I held it. It felt mostly centered in my stomach. And then I tried to feel the physical elements in it. The earth, hardness or softness, the air, stillness or patterns of vibration, and fire, temperature, and water, cohesiveness or fluidity. Sometimes colour and texture. It was a hard sphere pulsing in the centre, hot and fiery red. Next, I shifted to sense deeply all the feelings interwoven in it. Fear, pain, sadness, longing, and hunger were all present, along with a general aversion to feeling these states. I named each one softly. Then, while feeling into the centre of the fire, pain, and hunger, I allowed whatever images wished to arise. There came a whole series of memories and pictures of abandonment and rejection. Often such images will open to early childhood or even to past lives, if one is willing to allow them. As I felt into this centre, I asked myself what beliefs and attitudes I held about it. The story that came out sounded like a child who says, there is something insufficient and wrong with me, and I will always be rejected. It was this belief, along with the attendant feelings, that I had identified with and contracted around. As each of these layers opened in awareness, the pain gradually eased, the feelings softened, and the fire subsided. As I continued to feel into the centre of the loneliness, I seemed to sense a hole or space in my belly that the pain had closed around. I named it and felt its deep hunger, longing, and emptiness. So here's the void. Then I let it open as much as I wanted, instead of closing around it as I had done for so many years. And the hole changed to open space, and its hungry quality shifted. And although it was empty, it became more like clear, empty space. And gradually, this filled with a sense of light and fulfillment. I was filled with a sense of ease and profound contentment and peace, resting in this open space. The whole notion of rejection and insufficiency was totally unnecessary. And I could see that all of it, the loneliness, the pain, the sadness, the thoughts of rejection, was a contraction of my body and mind based on the frightened and very limited sense of myself that I had carried from my childhood. So, I think that writes about that process so beautifully. And so what going through this work on the self, working on the self this way, is quite a profound way to work. And what it develops in us is this extraordinary trust in the self that, as we go on with the work, that, I can trust myself. I have myself to fall back on because I know what to do. And I know when a desire or some strange idea arises in my head that I should go and do something or other, I know I start to really understand the coding, and the work, I am able to work on myself much more quickly. As time goes by, it all speeds up. And, I can really get through the work as long as I'm willing to embrace it and to look in the mirror. That's the key. And so from this comes a radical trust. A radical trust in myself and a radical trust in the process that I have adopted. And a radical trust that a higher divine being is working with me. that I am not alone, that I have never been alone, and that I never will be alone. Because when I connect in such a deep way with myself, I connect to the other eternal relationship in my life, which is my relationship with the source, with the creator, or with God. And so that brings tonight to a close. And so if anyone would like to ask questions, please do.
Yes, Jude, I just want to sympathize and, I actually felt tears in my eyes when he actually mentioned that experience, when he read that story. Wow.
Yeah.
Like it's not a story, it's a reality, right?
Yeah.
So really we feel it, no?
Yeah.
And it's just, we have to be so humble, so kind to help others.
And to help ourselves too.
Very important. And if we need counseling, we need to go to a counselor. Yeah.
That's right. Just find a good one.
Find a good one like yourself, huh?
Yeah, like Judy.
Yeah, Jude. Yes.
Find a good one. That's all you need.
Yeah. Now, really emotional because it's very hard. People, what they are going through, we don't really know. So we have to actually be very delicate in the way we deal with people. So
yes,
because we really don't know.
People walk into a room and we have no idea what they've been through, where they've come from, what their childhood was like, what their life has been like. We have no idea.
That's right. That's right.
No idea what comes into the room with them. All the stories, all the experiences, all the beliefs, all the pain, all the loss, whatever. We have no idea.
Yeah. So we have to fill them with mercy, with love, with compassion, with humility, no?
Fill ourselves, yeah.
Yes. And fill them with it as well. Give them contentment, like give them some hope.
Huh? And unless we do that for ourselves, we can't help anybody else.
Yes, if we are full, we can expand. We can spread it out. No. Thank you. Deeply, yes. I love it. I love the way you actually express that, and it's just so beautiful. I think how people can actually do that more for others will be very beneficial. Acceptance is first, and then feeling ourselves, and then giving it out to the world. Thank you. Thank you, Jude.
And I'm reminded of the words of Daddy Prakash Mani, who left the body in 2007 or 8. She was the head of the Brahma Kumaris. Amazing, an absolutely amazing soul. And when I first met her in America, she said this. She said, only a powerful soul can afford to be humble. Only a powerful soul can offer love. When we are weak, we become selfish. When we are empty, we take. But when we are filled, we automatically give to all. That is our nature. And she was someone whose very presence in a room gave to everyone. She did not have to open her mouth. And her presence was she was the embodiment of humility and compassion and love. And people would just melt in her presence. And I would watch, because I was asked to attend a number of these events. She could walk into a room with 500 or 600 business leaders in the room, and there'd be a lot of ego in the room, believe me. And men would cry. They would cry. That was just her presence. And I remember being in Mount Abu for a special gathering event, and there were a lot of business leaders and people there. And they were there for about 5 or 6 days, and on the day that it finished, there was, in the main sort of part of the campus, there was Daddy Prakash Mani and Daddy Janki were there, and they were giving what they call come soon, go soon toli to all the guests. And so we were all outside, and I was standing on this little wall so that I could see. It was all this white marble everywhere. And after they'd taken toli, this business leader, he was a CEO from somewhere, came over. He put his head on my shoulder because I was standing on the wall, and sobbed and sobbed and sobbed. And then another man came and did the same on the other shoulder. And he was, again, some CEO from multinational. I had these two guys absolutely sobbing. And that was her presence. People melted. She had a presence that would just melt people's egos right down to nothing. They'd pick it up again, of course, when they got down the mountain. But yeah, it was just amazing to see the effect she had on people. So, my dear friend,
I would like to share a story, actually, about Daddy Prakash Mani.
Yes.
Because I met the 3 daddies on stage one time.
Mm-hmm.
But my first experience to Madhaban. And here I am going first time, didn't know nothing. And then all of a sudden, we were chopping like vegetables in the morning. And all of a sudden this car just arrives. And this is Daddy Prakash Mani and Daddy Janki arriving at Ahmedabad. Wow. Everyone left whatever they were chopping. They were just there. Wow. Daddy Prakash Mani. Wow. And, everyone is just, at the door, just to welcome her with flowers and everything. Such a kind-natured person.
She's beautiful.
If I've met her, I'm so glad I have met her. And it was just it was actually no one was doing any cooking. Forget the cooking. I'm going to see Daddy. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
So humility. Actually, I felt that humility and the love. And really, Daddy Prakash Mani, if you see her, really, she gave you so much strength. And that's what I carry in my life. Really,
yes,
Baba says, light, and that is light.
And to have known that soul during her life is something just very, very rare and precious.
Yeah, and very special.
Absolutely.